She took in a struggling college student, not knowing he'd transform her life forever. Claire Bennett had grown accustomed to the quiet, the kind that settled into every nook of her two-story stone house in the peaceful little town of Willillaford. Most days the only sounds were the soft ticking of the mantel clock, or the distant hum of a car on the cobbled main street. It had been almost 4 years since her husband Peter passed away, and while she'd adjusted to living alone, there were moments when the silence felt like a heavy weight. On that late September afternoon, the air was cool, the sky a somber gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Claire was returning from the local market, her wicker basket swaying at her side, when she spotted him. A young man sat on the low stone wall marking the edge of her small front garden. His shoulders were hunched, his jeans damp at the knees, and a worn leather satchel rested beside him. He looked as though he'd been there for hours. Claire slowed her pace, her usual reserve giving way to curiosity. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice carrying a natural warmth. The young man looked up, startled. "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to linger. I was just taking a rest." There was a blend of embarrassment and exhaustion in his voice. Up close, she could see he was no older than 22, with neatly kept brown hair and tired eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Long day?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "Long week, actually. I'm Daniel Parker," he continued. "I was staying in student housing for college, but he trailed off, glancing away. "They told me I had to leave. I couldn't keep up with the rent." Claire felt an unexpected pang in her chest. She'd been a student many years ago, and remembered the mix of pride and desperation that came with trying to make ends meet. "So where are you staying now?" Daniel let out a short, forced laugh that didn't quite sound casual. "Nowhere really. Just hoping to find something before it gets dark." The clouds overhead shifted, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Without thinking, Claire said, "You can't sit out here all afternoon in the rain. I have a spare room upstairs. Nothing fancy, but it's warm, and the roof doesn't leak." He blinked at her as if she'd offered him the moon. "That's very kind, but I don't think I can afford." "We'll sort that out later," she interrupted briskly. "Come on, you'll catch your death out here." 5 minutes later, Daniel stood in her entryway, water dripping from him onto the old Persian rug. Claire fetched a towel from the linen closet and handed it to him. "Upstairs," she said, pointing toward the narrow staircase. "First door on the right. It's furnished bed, desk, wardrobe. The bathroom's next to it. You can pay what you can manage." He took the towel, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you. Honestly, I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," she replied with a small smile. "Just get yourself dry and warm." As Daniel disappeared up the stairs, Claire set her market basket on the kitchen counter. The rain pattered softly against the windows, and for the first time in years, the house felt different. Not just hers anymore, but alive again. She didn't know why she'd offered the room so quickly, but as she listened to the faint sound of footsteps above, she felt a quiet sense of contentment. Upstairs, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, the towel draped around his shoulders, the tension in his body easing for the first time in days. He glanced around the modest but clean room, then closed his eyes. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it felt like a second chance. In the days that followed, Daniel settled quietly into the upstairs room. He kept mostly to himself at first, coming and going with the measured politeness of someone afraid of overstaying his welcome. Mornings were early for him. By the time Claire was up and making tea, he had already left for classes at Westfield College. Claire quickly noticed his routine. Home just after 5, a quick change, then off again to his part-time job at a small bookstore in the center of Willillaford. Some nights he returned past 9, looking tired but carrying the faint scent of old books and rain on his coat. She wasn't one for fussing, but it became impossible not to notice that he rarely cooked anything substantial. One evening she made too much shepherd's pie, at least that's what she told herself, and placed a plate at the top of the stairs. "In case you're hungry," she called out. By the time she went back to check, the plate was empty, washed, and left neatly on the landing. The same thing happened again 2 nights later with a roast chicken dinner, and again with a generous slice of apple crumble. She never mentioned it, and he never thanked her directly, but they both understood the quiet exchange. Gradually, small gestures began to flow both ways. When a gusty autumn wind blew the garden gate off its latch, Daniel fixed it without being asked, oiling the hinges so it no longer squeaked. He carried her groceries in from the market without a word. And once, when she struggled to reach a high shelf in the kitchen, he appeared behind her and gently took the jar down. One particularly crisp Saturday morning, Claire found him sweeping leaves off the front path. "You don't have to do that, you know," she said, opening the door. "I don't mind," he replied, smiling faintly. "It's nice to keep things tidy. Helps clear my head." That afternoon, Claire invited him in for tea. They sat at the kitchen table, steam curling up from their mugs, the scent of Earl Grey filling the air. It started with small talk, the weather, the bookstore, the quirks of the old house, but gradually the conversation deepened. Daniel spoke about growing up in a quiet farming village, how moving to Lilliford had felt like stepping into another world. Claire shared stories from her own youth, the dreams she once had of becoming a writer before life had taken her in different directions. Over the weeks, these tea-time conversations became a quiet ritual. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, the warmth between them needing no words. Claire began to see Daniel less as a tenant and more as a younger brother, someone to look out for, but also someone whose presence made her home feel alive again. Daniel, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. There was something about Claire's steady kindness that made him feel safe, like he belonged. One evening after they'd shared tea and ginger biscuits, Daniel lingered in the doorway before heading upstairs. "Claire," he said quietly, I really appreciate you letting me stay here. I don't know what I'd have done without you." She gave a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "We all need a bit of help sometimes, Daniel. And besides, it's nice having someone around." That night, as he lay in bed, Daniel stared at the faint moonlight spilling across the ceiling. He thought about the long, cold evenings he might have spent wandering the streets if not for Claire's offer. And as he closed his eyes, he made himself a promise. One day, he would find a way to repay her kindness in a way she would never forget. The chill of early winter crept into Lilliford, frosting the garden edges and leaving breath hanging in the air like ghostly clouds. The mornings were darker, the evenings shorter, and Claire found herself worrying about Daniel more often. She began to notice little things, the way he sometimes slipped out without breakfast, or how his portion at dinner would be noticeably smaller when they happened to eat together. First she thought it was simply habit. But one evening as she carried a tray of tea to the living room, she caught a glimpse of his dinner plate in the sink, barely touched. The next day she found out why. She'd returned from the post office earlier than expected and saw him at the kitchen counter, carefully counting coins into a small envelope. "Is that for rent?" she asked lightly, though she already suspected the truth. He shook his head. "No, my mom's not been well. Medicine's expensive and, well, I try to send her something each week." Claire leaned against the door frame, her heart tightening. "And what about you?" Daniel gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I'll manage. I always do." Later that week, a storm rolled in, sheets of rain hammering against the windows, the wind rattling the garden gate. It was nearly midnight when Claire heard the front door open. Daniel stepped inside, drenched from head to toe, water dripping from his hair onto the rug. "Good heavens, Daniel!" she exclaimed, rushing to fetch a towel. "What on earth happened?" He laughed quietly, shaking the water from his jacket. "The bus was late. I had my umbrella, but there was this old man at the stop. He didn't have one. Couldn't just leave him there." Claire stared at him for a moment before handing over the towel. "You're impossible," she muttered, though there was no bite in her words. The next morning she noticed his shoes by the door, still damp, the leather stiffening in the cold. Without telling him, she set them by the fire to dry and slipped a folded 20-pound note into his satchel. When he later found it, she simply told him she must have overpaid him for picking up her groceries. He didn't argue, but she saw the faint flicker of understanding in his eyes. Over the following weeks, Claire's quiet gestures continued. She'd buy extra milk and bread by accident, knowing it would save him a trip. She replaced the worn blanket on his bed with a thick, warm one. She even mended the tear in his winter coat while he was at work. Daniel noticed it all, though he never said much. But in his own way, He returned the kindness, shoveling snow from the path before she woke, repairing the leaky kitchen tap without being asked, and carrying heavy logs in for the fireplace. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate, Daniel said suddenly, "You've done a lot for me, Claire. More than I deserve." She looked over at him, her expression soft but firm. "It's not about what you deserve. It's about what people need, and right now you need someone in your corner." There was a silence between them then, not awkward but weighted with understanding. Claire realized she no longer saw Daniel as just a tenant. He was part of the home now, part of the rhythm of her days. Daniel meanwhile knew something else. He couldn't let her kindness go unanswered. Somewhere inside a plan was forming, and he intended to see it through. By midwinter, the snow in Willilafort had softened into a damp chill, the kind that seeped into one's bones. The days were short, the skies often gray, but inside Claire's home, there was warmth from the fire, from the smell of bread baking, and from the growing companionship between her and Daniel. It was on one such evening, as she was setting a loaf to cool on the kitchen counter, that Daniel came in, his cheeks pink from the cold, and his eyes alight in a way she hadn't seen before. "I've been shortlisted," he said, almost breathless. Claire looked up from slicing the bread. "Shortlisted for what?" "For the National Scholars Presentation. It's in a month in Kingsford. They choose the top students from colleges all over to present research projects. If I do well, it could mean funding for the rest of my degree, maybe even a placement after graduation." Claire felt a rush of pride for him. "That's wonderful, Daniel. What will you present?" "My paper on sustainable urban planning," he said, though his voice faltered. "The only problem is, there's a travel fee, plus materials. It's more than I can manage right now." She didn't even hesitate. "Then I'll cover it." His eyes widened. "Claire, I can't let you." "You can," she interrupted gently. "And you will. This isn't charity, Daniel. Think of it as an investment in someone with the talent to make a difference." For a moment, he said nothing, his expression caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. Then he smiled, a small quiet smile that spoke volumes. "All right, but only if you let me pay you back someday." "Deal," she replied, though they both knew she didn't care if the money ever returned. From that night on, the evenings in the living room became a shared project. Daniel would spread his notes across the coffee table, and Claire would listen patiently as he rehearsed. Sometimes she'd interrupt with a thoughtful question. Other times, she'd suggest a clearer way to phrase his points. Her feedback wasn't just polite. It was sharp, insightful, the kind of input that pushed him to refine his work. "You'd have made a fine lecturer," he told her once as she adjusted a line in his opening statement. She laughed. "Too late for that. I'm happy being your audience." The neighbors began to notice the change in the house. Mrs. Godfrey from next door mentioned over the garden wall that Claire seemed lighter somehow. The postman commented on how often he heard laughter from the living room window. Claire realized she did feel lighter. Watching Daniel throw himself into the work, seeing his confidence grow, it brought her a kind of joy she hadn't felt in years. The day of the trip arrived before she knew it. Daniel stood in the hallway, smartly dressed in a navy suit they had chosen together from a second-hand shop. The morning light caught the neat fold of his tie, the shine of his polished shoes. "Ready?" she asked, handing him a paper bag with sandwiches, just in case. He nodded, but she caught the flicker of nerves in his eyes. "More than ready, but I'll be glad when it's over." At the station, she stood on the platform as the train pulled in. Daniel turned back just before boarding. "Claire, whatever happens, thank you for everything." She smiled, keeping her voice steady. "Go and show them what you're made of." As the train pulled away, she stayed until the last carriage disappeared. The platform felt quieter without him, and she realized she'd be counting the days until his return. The first evening without Daniel in the house felt strange. Claire had grown used to the faint creak of the stairs when he came home late, the muffled clink of a cup in the kitchen, or the low hum of his voice when he spoke on the phone to his mother. Now the room seemed to echo with stillness. She tried to distract herself, ironing, reorganizing the pantry, even baking a small batch of scones, but her mind kept drifting to him. Was the presentation going well? Did he arrive safely? Was he eating properly? The first day passed without any message. By the second, she convinced herself he was simply busy. By the third, her unease settled into a constant ache in her chest. On the fourth morning, she tried calling him. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. "It's me," she said into the receiver, trying to keep her voice light. "Just wondering how it's going. No rush. Call when you can." Hours later, still no reply. She checked the time difference between Willillaford and Kingsford. No excuse there. She even considered calling the college, but decided she might be overreacting. Still, that night, she found herself glancing out of the living room window every time headlights passed on the road. It was the fifth evening when her phone finally buzzed. A short text appeared on the screen. "Back tomorrow evening. Please be at home." No explanation, no detail. Her relief was immediate, but so was her curiosity. Why so brief? Why the insistence that she be home? She spent most of the next day keeping herself busy. She dusted the living room shelves, polished the brass handles on the kitchen cupboards, even took a walk to the market to pick up fresh lamb for roasting. She also stopped at the bakery for a Victoria sponge cake, his favorite, telling herself it would be a welcome home treat. As the afternoon faded, she set the dining table for two, lighting the candles she usually saved for Christmas or special occasions. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm amber glow across the room. Outside, the sky deepened into a rich navy. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 6. Claire was in the kitchen checking the roast when she heard the sound she'd been waiting for all week, the front gate clicking shut. Her heart leapt. She wiped her hands on a tea towel and turned just as the door opened. Daniel stepped inside, his cheeks flushed from the cold, his eyes brighter than she'd ever seen them. He was holding something behind his back, and the corners of his mouth curled into a smile that was half mischief, half triumph. "You made it back," she said, trying to keep her voice steady even as her relief washed over her. "I told you I would," he replied, stepping closer. "I brought something with me." "What is it?" "You'll see," he said, that grin widening. "But not yet. First, I want to say," he paused as though gathering his thoughts. "Claire, the past few months, you've been more than a landlord. You've been a friend, family even. And I've wanted to find a way to thank you properly." Claire felt her throat tighten. "Daniel, wait," he said gently, still holding whatever it was hidden behind him. "I think tonight's the night you'll understand exactly what I mean." And with that, he stepped into the firelight, ready to reveal the surprise he had carried all the way home. Daniel stepped forward into the glow of the fire, his shadow stretching across the living room wall. He slowly brought his hands from behind his back, revealing a sleek black frame wrapped in gold ribbon. Inside it was a crisp certificate embossed with a seal and bold lettering at the top. Claire's eyes widened. "Daniel, is that—" "I won," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. "First place. The judges called it one of the best presentations they've ever seen." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small medal attached to a deep blue ribbon. "This came with it." Claire covered her mouth, laughter and tears threatening to spill out all at once. "Oh, Daniel, that's incredible." But he wasn't finished. He set the medal gently on the mantelpiece before taking out a plain white envelope. He held it out to her, the weight of it pressing against her palm. "What's this?" she asked, frowning slightly. "My prize money," he said. "It's enough to pay you back for the rent and everything else you've done." Before you say anything, he raised a hand when she started to speak. "I know you didn't help me for money, but I need you to understand. You gave me more than a place to sleep. You gave me a chance to keep going when I was ready to give up. This is my way of showing you it mattered." Claire stared at the envelope, her vision blurring. "Daniel, I never wanted." She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "You don't owe me anything. Not now, not ever." "I know," he said softly. "That's why I'm giving it to you. Because you never asked for it. Because you're the reason this happened at all." She opened the envelope and saw the neat stack of notes inside, the reality of it settling in her chest. But it wasn't the money that moved her. It was the fact that he had carried this thought all the way through, from the moment he'd first stepped into her house, damp and tired, to this evening by the fire. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire set the envelope on the coffee table and picked up the medal instead. "This," she said, holding it gently, Belongs here. She hung it from a small hook on the mantelpiece where it caught the flicker of the firelight. Daniel smiled. So you're keeping it? Of course I am. It's a reminder, she said, her voice steady now, that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply open your door. They moved to the dining table where the roast lamb waited, its scent mingling with the faint sweetness of the Victoria sponge cake. The candles flickered, the room warm and golden. Over dinner they talked about everything: the trip, the presentation, the judges' questions, the train ride home. Daniel's words tumbled out in excitement, and Claire listened, feeling as though she were witnessing not just a victory, but the unfolding of a life that had only just begun to bloom. When the plates were cleared and the fire burned low, Daniel looked across the table and said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere, you know. Not unless you throw me out." Claire chuckled. "You'd have to do something pretty awful for that to happen." They sat there for a while longer, the silence now warm and full, the kind shared by people who know they've become family in everything but name. Outside, the night settled gently over Willillaford. The streets hushed, the air still. Inside, the little stone house glowed with the kind of light that no lamp could create. The steady, enduring light of kindness returned, and a friendship that would last a lifetime.